The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they had been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us is Professor Ted Shaw, Professor of Law at Columbia University and the former Director Counsel of the Legal Defense Fund, which is the thing that's opened up the door for a lot of black folks all over. Hi, Ted. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. Always good to be with you.
Now, as the Director Counsel of the Legal Defense Fund, you handle so many civil rights cases and cases in protecting the rights of individuals. Of those cases that you handle specifically during your tenure, which one do you think are most memorable?
Well, that's really a hard question.
That's a hard question. That's like, which ball game did you play the best? Yeah.
You know, I can tell you a few that come to mind right away. The two Michigan cases involving admissions to colleges and universities for African Americans, you know, diversity, affirmative action. Those were huge cases. They were very important cases. So they come to mind. But I also...
Well, let's tell the public a little about those cases because you went over pretty fast. That was a landmark case in terms of affirmative action.
It was. And my involvement in those cases is twofold. Ironically enough, perhaps not ironically, I actually left the Legal Defense Fund in the middle of the years that I worked for it. I worked for the Legal Defense Fund for about 26 years. And, you know, all but, actually over a span of 26 years, but all but 3 of those years I was at the Legal Defense Fund. Those 3 years I was at the University of Michigan Law School teaching. I thought that it was time to, you know, stretch out and do something else, and so I went into law school teaching. They had recruited me. I ended up at Michigan for 3 years, and not long after I got there, I went and spoke to the dean who had hired me, and I told him that I thought there was a problem with the way Michigan was doing admissions. And the problem was that we were not in compliance completely, you know, with the best of intentions, I think, but we weren't in compliance completely with the only governing precedent that the Supreme Court had laid down, which was the Bakke case decided in 1978. The Bakke case said, among other things, you couldn't have separate pools of applicants, and Michigan had black students involved in recruiting black applicants and looking at their applications, and Latino students doing the same for Latino applicants. I thought that signaled separate pools, and it was problematic. I went in and spoke to the dean. We went round and round on it. He didn't quite get it right away, but then he was very bright, very thoughtful, and he got it. And he appointed a committee. I served on the committee, and we redid the admissions policy. And the reason that I was compelled to go see him was because I knew that our adversaries, folks who were opposed to affirmative action / diversity, were out there looking for public universities and colleges to sue, and wanted to make sure that Michigan and no other place was one of them. And I had worked on these issues while at the Legal Defense Fund. And so it turns out that the policy that we adopted was the policy that eventually was challenged and that was upheld in the Supreme Court. Because of that, I did not represent African American students in that lawsuit because there's a lawyer witness problem I had. I was deposed as a witness because I was involved in drafting the policy. But at the end of the day, the policy that I was involved with drafting and adopting was upheld. Of course, my dean was Lee Bollinger, now president of Columbia University, and then after he was dean of the law school at Michigan, he was president of the University of Michigan, so he's a named defendant in the Michigan cases. There was another case involving the undergraduate school that also went up to the Supreme Court. The law school case was called Grutter. The undergraduate case is Gratz. In that case, I was lead counsel when I was back at the Legal Defense Fund by that time for black and Latino students who intervened. So I was involved in both cases. We filed an amicus brief in the law school case that allowed the Legal Defense Fund to say some things we needed to get off our chest about how the Supreme Court has made a wreck out of 14th Amendment case law but we also represented Black and Latino students in the undergraduate case. So that was Michigan, and that was huge.
But the sum and substance of that was that race could be considered along with other factors in making your admission determination.
That's right, and the Supreme Court, in effect, upheld Bakke and what was said in the Bakke case, although there was a question about whether that was actually controlling law because Bakke was a 4-4-1 split, with Justice Powell being the one, and his opinion bridged the camps of the people who were opposed to diversity and those who were in favor of it. And so people questioned about whether he had sufficient support to say that was a controlling opinion. Grutter put that to rest. And so now we have a very clear Supreme Court decision that says that basically colleges and universities can try to consciously enroll students of color, and that continues to be important. So that was an important case. But I can also think of cases that that weren't as well known. There were so many of them. I remember working on a death penalty case early in my career, and of course, that particular one for me stood out. It was the first time I was involved in capital punishment issues. I've worked on, we worked on at the Legal Defense Fund cases involving the way the drug war is being prosecuted and the way it's playing out, which is mass incarceration of African Americans. I know you're familiar with Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, but she's told the story about now what we've been doing in this country, which has caused and resulted in the consequential incarceration of mass numbers of African Americans, and new slavery, as some people call it.
But do you think that was intentional? Because it came out of the war on drugs, where supposedly drugs were infiltrating the community, there were murders and there were gang activity. Did this really come about intentionally to say, look, we're going to lock up a lot of young black men, or is this something that was an unintended consequence of that activity?
You know, it's both at the same time, and it might seem to be a contradictory answer or response, but I say it's both because, you know, to some degree, we certainly have a problem in this country. We have an insatiable appetite for drugs in this country. And in fact, it's not only in this country, you know, around the world. And we've been fighting this so-called war on drugs. I've concluded that this war on drugs can't be won. You know, I think we ought to have a new approach to drug policy, but that's another set of questions. And certainly drugs have devastated the African American community in a peculiar way. And there were African Americans who advocated that this war on drugs be fought in ways that would lead to harsh penalties. Certainly that's true. At the same time, we have a criminal justice system that reflects a historical and continuing inequality and inequity, with black people being treated differently for the same crimes that white people commit, and they don't get the same prosecution, the same treatment, the same penalties, the same sentences, et cetera. So the war on drugs, a lot of people, if you ask most Americans who use, for example, the most crack cocaine, they say crack is a black drug. It's not. And that's not to say a lot of black people didn't use it and it didn't have devastating impact, but there are more white people in absolute numbers. And then you get the crystal meth phenomenon, which is as devastating a drug, mostly, almost exclusively used in white communities. And you get a very different kind of reaction and response to those two phenomena.
But wasn't part of the response because of the street crimes associated with drugs, that one group of drug dealers would fight with another group of drug dealers and so on? Now, I'm not suggesting that this was the right policy, but I'm saying that was the climate under which that policy was implemented.
Yeah, well, no question. If you make drugs illegal, you create an entire market that is an underground economy, and people begin to fight one another for control of that underground economy. And you're right that these drug wars played out, and sometimes very violently. All of that is absolutely right. And I'm not suggesting that people who commit violent crimes, or for that matter, I'm not suggesting that people who distribute mass amounts of drugs should not be prosecuted. A lot of what is driving the war on drugs as it plays out right now in New York City, for example, is low-level drug crimes. The drug stops for that result in possession charges of marijuana on the street, and most of these stops, almost all of them, are of young Black and Latino men or young men and women these days. So 7,000 people in 1 year being stopped, almost all of them Black and Latino. And
700,000, right?
that's right. I'm sorry. I said 7,000. I meant to say 700,000. Thank you. 700,000. And as a consequence, what you see is the vast majority of these stops, people haven't done anything wrong. They don't find anything, drugs, weapons, or whatever. And a tiny percentage they may find drugs or weapons. But what you find is mass numbers of people whose data is being entered into the criminal justice system. Even people who are arrested or charged and are not convicted, their information stays in the system. Sometimes people who are not even arrested, their information finds its way into the system. But as a consequence, what you get is a huge data system that the mayor of New York City, that the chief of police, they say that there's nothing wrong with what they're doing, but it includes mass numbers of young Black people, Latino people, people of color, who are basically being treated as if they are criminals.
But hasn't there been a lawsuit suggesting that the police department has to remove those names of people who were stopped and were not found guilty or charged?
Yes, we've had organizations like the New York Civil Liberties Union, certainly the ACLU has been looking at these issues, the Center for Constitutional Rights. The organization that I led and worked at for many years, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, one of the last cases I authorized before I left was a case that involved vertical sweeps in housing projects that were being used again in a way that ended up criminalizing young people without regard to whether they were actually involved in criminal activity. Now, let me hasten to add, I grew up in public housing. I grew up in a community that was devastated by drugs. I lost many people who were close friends. I'm sure anybody in the Black community can say this, to drugs, anybody who grew up in New York City or urban area. And so I'm not arguing that we should not do anything to dissuade people from using drugs or to penalize them in some ways when they do it. To create disincentives. But this system that we have now of mass incarceration of African Americans, many who committed nonviolent offenses, and many of them, fairly low-level drug offenses, this system isn't working. When we criminalize a good portion of the African American community, you know the numbers. The Sentencing Project in Washington, D.C. has said that at some point in their life, in most American urban centers, 1 in 3 Black men part of the criminal justice system one way or another. The numbers may be even higher, and the numbers are increasing for young Black women. We represented a young Black woman when I was at the Legal Defense Fund named Kimber Smith, who got a lot of attention because of an article that was in Essence magazine. But her story was that she made a terrible mistake. She got romantically involved with a young man who was a drug dealer, but she herself was a Hampton University student when she did this. She never sold used drugs or handled them. She did carry money for him at times, and she knew what he was doing. She tried to back out of the relationship and couldn't. He threatened her. They went on a run because he was being pursued, charged with murder. He eventually he had murdered his best friend. He thought they were cooperating with the police. He was. And he eventually was shot and killed in Seattle. But by that time, she had escaped him and was on her way back to Virginia, where she was from, to turn herself in. So there's not a question about whether she should have been penalized. But she gets a 24-year sentence. She's sentenced as if she was a big drug king or queen pin. She was pregnant at the time with his child, gave birth in jail. What's the point of having her in jail for 24 years? Maybe she should have been incarcerated for some period of time, but 24 years? Well, we represented her, and tried to use that as an example of the criminal justice system going awry. President Clinton gave her a clemency. Tulia, Texas, a story now that is fairly well known. In the late 90s, 10% of the black population of a tiny town in Texas, in the Panhandle, arrested in a pre-dawn drug raid, pulled out of their houses in their pajamas, their hair undone, paraded in front of the cameras. No drugs, no weapons, no money found, all on the word of one undercover policeman whom we later showed to be corrupt and racist, for that matter. He was basically making up evidence, lying, fabricating evidence, because the problem is that the federal government gives huge amount of money to a lot of police departments to fight drugs. So you have these drug funds, or the drug war funds, and they need to find something to do with this money to justify their existence and continue to get more money. So he said that he wrote down evidence on his calf with a pen, a Sharpie or something like that. The bottom line is that people got sentences ranging from 20 to 300 years. Mm-hmm. The kingpin was supposed to be this hog farmer who lived in dire poverty, as one white hog farmer or farmer in Tulia said. If he was the drug kingpin, he must have spent all that money because he sure, or he hid it rather, because he sure didn't spend it. We got into this case along with other lawyers and worked to get these sentences overturned, and we were successful eventually. But this is an example of the drug war gone awry. So my point is that we have to rethink our policies with respect to this so-called war on drugs.
Now the question is, what is the process through which we go to rethink that? For example, New York City has a stop and frisk policy, which is being challenged all over the place. Is it the legal system that's going to make the difference? Is it going to be the public advocacy system? Is it going to be the politicians? Who's going to make the change? Because clearly what you describe happens too often in too many places.
Well, I think there's enough. The problem is big enough to have all of those. But
if you were to pick one thing, you're in charge of getting rid of this.
If I were to pick one, I would say the legislature, because the legislature makes the laws and can change the laws that govern all of this.
In other words, you'd make stop and frisk illegal?
Well, I would make them carry them out in legal ways. If there's a legitimate reason, we do have constitutional law that should govern this, but it's being ignored now, or the courts aren't really stepping in as they should.
Why aren't the courts stepping in?
Well, we have a Supreme Court that is very conservative and basically has given...
But I mean, even the local courts, I mean, this is a violation of the Constitution.
But they still get a lot of but the Constitution ultimately is interpreted by the Supreme Court, and they get the green light from the Supreme Court. And the green light has been given basically to the police to do anything they want and stop and frisk. And so a lot of the law that existed as we knew it when I went to law school, as I grew up, et cetera, basically has been ignored or it's been nibbled away. And as a consequence, there are not the kind of guidelines that make the police think twice.
But see, the law is there. They shouldn't be doing it. Now, do you need new law?
Well, I think we do. That's part of it. I think that we need more guidance for these police departments. You think about the Rockefeller drug law change that came about in New York. All these sentencing practices that sent up people to jail for life or a good chunk of their lives for sometimes minor drug offenses. We were able to exact a change in that, in part because we had lawyers who were advocating, raising these issues, but also we had people who were impacting public opinion, op-eds, et cetera. We had people in the legislature who began to get all this, and then finally we had a governor who began to get it, and we changed those laws. We need to address this stop and frisk. If this was an issue, if this was something that was happening to 700,000 white young people a year in New York City, does anybody think that the mayor or anybody else would stand by for it? I submit that we would not. And white people, young white people, use drugs in at least as much proportion, but actually in higher proportions than young black people. So one can talk about the difference between what's being done behind closed doors and what's being done on the street, and street level violence being and drug sales being prosecuted, and you can understand all of that. But the reality is that we do not go after white people or other people as we do young black and brown people.
Well, this is part of the racist tradition of the society, but I'm particularly concerned, I think our viewers are concerned, well, what do you do to change this? What you're doing and what the Civil Liberties Union is doing is very, very important. But changing the public attitude among the larger population is also very important.
It is, and public education is part of it. I mean, you know, I don't want to be trite or seem trite, but for example, this kind of conversation, you know, being aired is part of it. We need to have other conversations being aired because people make assumptions that are just dead wrong about who's using drugs and also who's being prosecuted for what. You know, they don't understand completely the level of incarceration for nonviolent minor drug offenses. All of these things need to get more public attention. That's absolutely right about it. You know, and we have to have a more balanced drug interdiction policy. So all these things are important. Who changes it? I think ultimately, you know, we all have to have a hand in this. Because all of this is being done, these people are being incarcerated in the name of the broader society.
What do you say to people in black and Latino communities where there is drug infestation?
Yes.
The drug dealers will stand on the corner,
yeah.
and nobody does anything about it.
Yeah. Well, two things. One is that, you know, again, we have internal and external demons in the African American community, and one of our internal demons is drugs. Now, my view is that while I don't excuse people who distribute mass, you know, in a mass way, drugs in any community, I also think that we have to focus on other avenues so that people don't feel compelled to use drugs or self-medicate. There are always going to be some people who use drugs. Whether it's alcohol or whether it's you know, cocaine, that's going to happen. And the question is, how do we treat those people? Do we penalize them and try to force them to get treatment? Do we incarcerate them for 20 or 30 years? What sense does that make? You know, I mean, we have to treat drugs as, in part, a health problem in this country, because it is. But we also have to give people young people in particular, a kind of hope, you know, education, employment opportunities, etc. Because I know a lot of the people I grew up with, I'm not trying to excuse it, but I know a lot of them were self-medicating, and they, you know, they were hopeless. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, that's part of it. Mm-hmm. I think that you know, we have to begin to pay attention to what's going on in our cities, and sadly, even now, and I'm reluctant to say this, it pains me to say it, but even under this administration in Washington, we're not paying enough attention because, you know, the administration is focused on other things.
What would you have them do?
Oh, I think we need to have policies with respect to education. Now, certainly the administration is focused on education, but I think we have to have policies that go beyond education. I think we have to have, in particular, job programs for young people. Real jobs and real job training. It's not that the president doesn't talk about that at all, because he does. But the president can't do it alone. You can't do it without Congress also playing a role in it. But we have to have real jobs, and we have to have jobs that are particularly focused on people who live in our central cities. In other words, young black and brown people.
One of the things is society has changed so much in the past 20 years with the technology, with the outsourcing of jobs.
Yeah.
So there's a whole reevaluation that needs to be done. The prison system has been an employment system for a certain number of people.
Absolutely.
And so we have to be aware of the fact that that's one of the motivations.
That's right.
But I think what you...
And it's been a political empowerment system, too, for rural, in New York, upstate communities. That's being changed now. And you know what I'm talking about, the fact that prisoners were counted where they were in prison instead of the communities they came from.
Well, one of the things that you and other legal defense people are doing is to keep the public's eye on these issues. And that's very difficult because the average person says, well, if he's going to jail or she's going to jail, he must be guilty.
Right.
You find that that's not necessarily true.
Well, look, one of the things that I thought about when I was at the Legal Defense Fund for many years, I think about it now. Every night I thought about, often, almost every night, if not every night, I thought about the people who wrote to us, whose letters we couldn't even answer, much less, respond to in a way of providing legal representation. And among them were people, I have no doubt, who were innocent. There are innocent people who are sentenced to jail and who are serving time. But whether people are innocent or not, where we have a system in which what we're doing is criminalizing low-level drug usage, that doesn't make sense any longer. And we have to begin to address that problem. A lot of what drove the explosion of the prison population in the last 20 years was low-level drug offenses, not people who are selling, but people who were using, or people who maybe sold at a low level because they were supporting their habit, et cetera. And we have to have another way of approaching those issues and dealing with those folks.
But one of the things I think we need to do, we need to have more legislative hearings. We need to have more discussions with people like Professor Ted Shaw at Columbia University, because these are issues that have to do with the freedom and justice for everybody, regardless of race. I want to thank Ted Shaw for being with us in this wonderful conversation today. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.